Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we are going to migrate the cart context over from using useState and useEffect to useReducer. So I want to discuss useReducer strategies when it comes to migrating some of these more complicated contexts like we have. To quickly go over what we did, we know that primarily inside of our current cart provider, we have a bunch of useStates that track 4 individual values that we then read from the cart context. These are the isCartOpen, the cart items, the cart count, and the cart total. What we've determined is that we are exporting out from this context different methods that a user can fire or a developer can fire in order to update the current cart items. And then whenever these cart items get updated, what we do is we then also derive new cart count and new cart total and then respectively set them from their useState setter functions. So what we need to do instead with a reducer is we want to extrapolate out these 4 readable values into a reducer, because reducers only store readable values. So how are we going to do this? Well, first what we need to do is we need to think about the shape of our final output. So the easiest way to do that is to actually create the initial state object first. And this initial state object is going to include all of the readable values that we currently have inside of our context, because the context is just storing these values individually inside of their own useState. They also already have their default values, so this initial state just gives us the object that we need to keep track of when it comes to what our actual reducer should return. So let's create that reducer now. This is going to be our cart reducer. And as you remember, it's a function that gets the state as well as the action object. And then what we need to do is we need to destructure off the 2 properties that come on the action, which are the type and the payload. Once we have the type and payload, now we determine with these 2 values from the action, what do we need to return as the updated state? So here, when we start thinking about this, oftentimes you know you need a reducer and it gets a little confusing. So it's important that you just set up the reducer first. You know you need a switch statement and the switch is going to be off the type. You know that you're going to have some default, and the default is most likely always going to be us throwing a new error, where the error is going to be us saying unhandled type of, and then the type in cart reducer. And the reason, of course, as we do this is because our cart reducer should only be receiving actions that we have accounted for. If there is, for some reason, we're getting an action that we have not accounted for, well, we shouldn't be receiving that action. Or it tells us that we have written code that we have not covered, if we're expecting this reducer to receive an action, and we need to respond to it appropriately. After this, now we need to think about our cases. So when you think about the case of what you're going to do in your reducer, here is a very important distinction about your reducer and a best practice as well. Your reducer should not handle any business logic, meaning that inside of a reducer, if we were to receive some item, some of you might be thinking, oh, let me just create actions, for example, like an add to cart action. And this action should receive, or should be in the shape of the action object, or the type, let's just say, is add to cart like this. And then the item that I'm adding as the payload is going to be the item to add. Let's just assume that this might be a valid way to create this action. There's no problem with us dispatching out an action like this. This is perfectly writable code. But the reason why you don't want to do this is because now inside of your reducer, in order to appropriately respond to this, might have to be something like this, where what you do is you then inside say, okay, I need to figure out what these new cart items are. So that's the add cart item. So I might say something like return back, of course, spread through state, and then cart items points to add to cart item, and then the payload. As we know, the payload is the item to add. and then add to cart. In fact, we can even here, we know that our add cart item needs also the cart items. So we can even just say, hey, give me the state.cart items that is currently there. And then of course pass the payload. Now this logic may work, but the problem is that this makes your reducer a lot harder to read. So what you should do instead is actually make it so that your payload should already be whatever you need to update. Because now if you think about it, inside of add to cart, we also need to update the cart total and the cart count. So how are we going to do this? We're going to write additional logic to take the output of this cart item inside of this code somewhere so that we can conditionally decide, oh, we need cart total. So then cart total is going to take this cart items reduce function off of the new cart items we're getting in, which we receive back from add to cart item. You see how it already gets really convoluted? We have to figure out all these conditional checks so that the right logic is happening here, right? You can see how we do new cart items like this is equal to add item to cart. And then of course we need to get the new cart total. Like this is equal to new cart items dot reduce as we wrote before. And we just have to then update it here. But this makes your reducer, as you can see, really bloated and hard to read. This makes it very difficult as well for us to make these changes because you can imagine if we had multiple case statements, we're looking at a giant reducer function. And we want to keep our functions as light and tight as possible, even if they're reducer functions. All this reducer should care about is really just updating the state. It shouldn't worry about anything regarding how to update that state, as in like what values, what business logic that state should end up in. Instead, that should all be passed to us. Our reducer should simply be the one saying, hey, I got some payload. I'm just going to update it with the appropriate values. So to do that, what we need to do is split up some of this logic. So to split up the logic, you want to think about dispatching an action that already includes all of the values that this needs. Now, before we start thinking about it being add to cart, that was just my example. You want to think about the type here. What's the type of action we want to set? Well, we can actually take inspiration from what we've written here inside of our typical hook-based flow. We have these values that we get from state. And then what we do is we respond when the cart items update so that we actually generate the new total and we generate the new cart count, and then we set them respectively. So instead, technically, we could include cart count, cart total, and the new cart items all inside of one action. And as we can tell, based on our logic, it's generic. If cart items changes, then we generate a new count. Whether it's clearing an item from the cart, whether it's adding a quantity to a cart item, whether it's decreasing the quantity of a cart item. The cart count function and the cart total functions are all generic enough. It's really these actual adding, removing, and clearing that are unique. So in this case, what we can do is we can actually create a generic action that says, hey, whenever cart items get set, then what I want you to do, I want you to update the state with the payload. And this payload is going to contain the shape that we want. So it's going to have the cart items on it, or the new cart items. It's going to have the cart count on it, and it's also going to have the cart total. And these are all going to be the new values that we finally want to store. And that's what we should do inside of this code. So that is going to be my challenge to you. Figure out how to create a new function that can encapsulate all this so that you can dispatch a correct action that will then update according to what we've written here. So give a crack at that. You're going to have to write the function in here. And just to give you a bit of a hint, it's going to be something, I like to call it something like update cart items reducer. This is a function that is just going to receive the new cart items. You can even call them new cart items if you want to be explicit. And what they're going to do is they're going to have to utilize the code we already have inside of our effects and then respectively update the actual reducer value. Where you call this function, that's my challenge to you as well. So figure out, based on what I've mentioned here, how you're going to split up this logic and write out this function. And then in the next video, we'll do it together. I'll see you in the next video.